All right, let's jump right into a FortiGate basic configuration. First, we'll have a topology of what we're going to be configuring. Then we'll go over how do we get access to the FortiGate. Then we'll cover a bit of network configuration, what firewall registration is and how to do it, as well as some basic security configurations, logging and alerts, and then we'll cover a little bit of troubleshooting and monitoring. And if you are brand new to the FortiGate firewall or even firewalls in general, I'd really recommend to view the whole video. I think in the long term, this is going to save you a lot of time. But if you are familiar and you're looking for a specific section or a specific topic, just check through on the bottom here, check in the chapters and find the chapter that's suited for exactly what you're looking for. So in this environment, we're going to have a Windows machine that we're going to be connecting up to our FortiGate. So the FortiGate will, by default, own the IP address of 192.168.1.99, which we'll have access to. And then also, by default, it's WAN port, which could be named something different based on the model that you have. But in my case, it will be WAN 1, and this port will be configured to receive a DHCP address. And in this case, the DHCP address that the FortiGate will be receiving from the ISP modem will be 166.166.1.2. So after we power the FortiGate on, what we're going to be focusing on when we are on site looking at the unit is the status LED. So we want the status LED to go from an off state to a blinking state to a solid state. Once it's a fully solid state, the unit has fully booted and now we can access it. So if we have a FortiGate model that looks similar to what we're seeing in front of us here, then we would be connecting to any of the ports between 1 and 8. But we might also have a FortiGate which possibly has a management port, MGMT. If that's the case, then plug into the management port instead of any of the other interfaces. And then once you're connected to one of these interfaces, you should receive an IP address within the range of 192.168.1.0. Okay, so let's access the FortiGate now, 192.168.1.99. The default username is going to be admin with no password. So then let's just add a new password here. Okay, now we have access to the unit. All right, so we can start by accessing some of our system settings. And yeah, we can change our host name here. We can also change our idle timeout so that we don't get automatically logged out after, say, 5 minutes only when we're using the firewall. And then we can also maybe change the theme here too. We can change our colors, especially if we have multiple FortiGates. This comes in handy. All right, let's take a look at our network configuration. So we can see under network interfaces that we have a device connected to port number 1 on the firewall, which is our Windows machine, and then another device connected to WAN 1. If we look at the WAN 1 IP address, where we have the IP of 166.166.1.2, and then we can also see the internal configuration. So this is a hardware switch which encompasses 7 ports, internal 1 to 7 on the firewall here. And let's take a look now at our routing table. So if we go to the dashboard, network, and then routing, we can see here that we have a default route via 166.166.1.1, which is our ISP. So let's take a quick test here and just make sure that we can actually access the internet. Perfect. And then maybe, make sure that our DNS is okay. All right. So that means the firewall itself can access the internet and there's no DNS issues. If we do need to actually see our DNS configuration of the firewall itself, we can go to Network DNS. Let's quickly go over another use case. Let's say instead of receiving an IP address via DHCP, we have a static IP address. We'll just use the same IP in this case. We save that, we hit OK. What we'll notice here is now we're not going to be able to access the internet anymore, right? And, let's look at the routing table here. And as we can see here, I think this might be just a little stale from that previous record. Nope, my mistake. No, all that is yeah, like you can see is we don't have 0.0.0.0. We no longer have that default route anymore, and that's because we're not receiving an IP address via DHCP, in which case that would prompt the FortiGate to automatically inject a default route by default. So, really in this case, all we have to do is we just find what our next hop is going to be, which is 166.166.1.1. And then now that we have that default route, I think that our internet will be restored again. Perfect. Okay, and back to the interfaces tab. So as we can see here is that the internal interface, it does encompass these 7 different FortiGate ports. Let's say if we had a case where maybe we wanted to connect a switch to port 2, well, what we could do in that case is we could create a new interface that would be considered a VLAN interface, and that would be residing under the internal interface. And let's say the VLAN ID is 100, right? And then we create the network. This would be the FortiGate's IP here. And then we just configure the access that we would want to allow to that particular VLAN interface. And then we can configure a DHCP server for devices that are connected to the access port of the switch. And then we hit OK. And this would be the idea of what we would see here. So now we can see that there is a VLAN, essentially a sub interface under this internal logical interface, which encompasses all these ports. So now if you were to connect a switch up to, say, internal 2, any tagged traffic that is arriving on the FortiGate tagged for VLAN 100 will actually be seen by the FortiGate on this particular interface, VLAN 100, and no longer the internal native VLAN interface. Okay, now the next step will be to make sure that we can allow traffic through the firewall. So under the policy and objects firewall policy, that is where we are able to configure a policy that's going to essentially allow, in our use case, it's going to allow that Windows machine, which we're on right now, to be able to access the internet. So when we double click this policy, we are required to add a name for it. So let's just call this Internet All for now. And there's not really much restrictions on this policy. So any traffic coming into the internal interface, which in this case is the Windows machine, going out the WAN interface based on the routing table lookup, matching a source and destination of all with a schedule and service of always and all, we are going to apply this NAT rule. So using the outgoing interface, the FortiGate is going to do a source NAT based on the WAN 1 IP address, which is 166.166.1.2. That's exactly what we want if we are sending traffic over the public internet, because if we do not have NAT enabled, then our internet or our ISP is going to see the traffic coming from a private IP address, and then it's going to drop the traffic. Okay, so now that we have the firewall policy configured, let's see if this policy actually works. So let's keep note of the byte counter that we see here, which is 233 kilobytes. So if we let's access Google, let's maybe do, let's do a quick speed test. Okay, now the speed test is complete. Now let's just refresh that firewall policy page. And there we go. Immediately we can see that the byte counter is increased. Not so important right now in this particular case, but once we have lots of different firewall policies, this can be very useful for us to be able to identify which policy that we might be matching. And there are other ways which we'll go into shortly here too. Okay, so let's access System FortiGuard, and let's quickly go over registration. So registration is the process in which, at least for the FortiGate in this example, where you can associate your FortiGate serial number with you as an organization, right? Why this is important is so that, let's say, for example, you call into Fortinet support for their TAC team, right? You can call into TAC and then provide your serial number or be able to create a ticket on your own before calling into Fortinet support. And then they will just check your serial number, make sure that there is valid support for the product, and then they'll be able to assist. Right? Another reason why is you want your product to be registered so that if you have any contracts, so for example, if I purchased Industrial DB here, which is currently not licensed on my FortiGate, if I were to purchase this service, then I can apply this contract to this particular FortiGate by being able to register that contract again with the firewall. So there's two ways that you can register your FortiGate. So one would be to register it via your FortiGate, as long as obviously that FortiGate has an internet connection, because it is going to be reaching out to FortiGuard. So you can do that by creating, in my case, I am already registered on this FortiGate, but you could create your account and register your FortiGate just via this System FortiGuard section. Alternatively, and my more preferred method would be to access support.fortinet.com. Start by registering if you haven't already, and then when you're ready, log in with your newly created credentials. Then on the main page, you can click Register Now, and then you can enter in your product serial number, service contract registration code, or license certificate to start the registration process. So in here, you'd start just by putting in your FortiGate serial number and then following the prompt. Once we're successfully registered, then we can actually take a look at the status of that registration. For example, this is, I believe this is the firewall that we're currently using. And we can, get a list of all of our service contracts and our existing support types, when they're activated and when the expiration dates are. Okay, so back to the FortiGate. So now we can confirm that the firewall is registered. We have firmware and general updates, application control signatures, our antivirus, our web filters all up to date. So now let's actually go and let's configure that on our policy. So as you can see, I've already checked all these boxes. Yours probably won't be checked until you enable these. But notice that IPS, or intrusion prevention, is not enabled here. So let's quickly go and enable that by going to System, Feature Visibility, and enabling intrusion prevention. And what the feature visibility section is there for is it's really just enabling a feature to be visible in the GUI. It's not actually disabling the feature entirely or enabling the feature entirely. It's just whether it can be seen in the GUI or not. So for example, if we look at the network section here, we can see that there's no dynamic routing protocols that are visible to us. Well, once we enable advanced routing, there we go. Now we can see RIP OSPF BGP, and the same applies for intrusion prevention. So now let's go back to our policy and enable IPS. Okay, and as for configuration, let's go over those quickly here too. Okay, so let's start with antivirus. So the default action for antivirus is going to be block if a known signature is found. Okay, and for web filter, the FortiGate is going to be looking at the HTTP and HTTPS traffic that's flowing through it, and it's going to be trying to, not exactly, but essentially it's going to be trying to check the URL of the traffic. So, and based on that URL, it's going to be able to categorize that particular website that you're accessing under one of any of these different categories here. So let's take a second and go over one example here. So if we open a web browser and go to FortiGuard.com and then do a web filter lookup, let's look at, for example, Fortinet.com. Fortinet.com is categorized as information technology. So based on what we have configured for information technology, let's take a look here. Based on what we have for information technology, that traffic will be allowed. But then we could, for example, change it to monitor so that we allow the traffic and we also are going to be saving a log record of that traffic. We could change it to block. We could change it to warning so that users would be prompted and they would have to bypass a warning signal before accessing the website, or we could require authentication. So if we required authentication, maybe we would want a specific LDAP group, for example. A user must authenticate within a certain LDAP group while they're accessing the URL. And once they do that, then they would actually get access to a website within this particular category of information technology. So for testing purposes, let's just try that. Let's configure that. So now our default web filter has information technology configured as blocked. Let's save our firewall policy. And then let's go to Fortinet.com. There we go, and as we can see, that website was blocked because the category of information technology is blocked. And then we can go and look in our log reports here for web filter, and then we can see that Fortinet.com was blocked. And if we click into the specifics of it, we can see a lot more details, such as the timestamp, the source interface, destination IP, the specific URL, and the policy ID that we've hit, which down the road will be very important, especially like I was saying before, if we have many policies. Now we can actually take that policy ID and we can, and various other bits of information such as the profile name, category, but coming back to that policy ID, now we can look at our firewall policy here. It's not enabled there by default, so I'll right click the header here and add ID. And then there we go. We can see on the far right there that the policy ID is number 1. So we've identified the policy where the traffic was blocked. Okay, so in the background, I've gone and I've re-allowed the information technology category, so we're no longer going to be blocked when we access Fortinet.com. So now let's take a look at the DNS filter. So the DNS filter, at first, it appears to have a very similar function, which is that we're looking at category-based filters, and we're seeing pretty much the exact same categories here, but the underlying logic in which the FortiGate is using to actually take action based off of the DNS filter versus the web filter is different. So for DNS filter, the FortiGate is going to be looking at the DNS response when a DNS query goes out. So let's try a similar test as before. We're going to block, or in this case, it's essentially we are actually redirecting the DNS response to a particular web page versus blocking, and that web page will be, in this case, it's a Fortinet IP here. So for example, if we took this IP, if we just pasted it in without doing anything, this is the website that we're going to be seeing. Right, web page block, because we're doing a DNS redirect versus actually proxying the HTTP or HTTPS traffic. Okay, so now let's test out a new configuration change here. So it looks like we still got through, so it's probably the web browser caching things. There we go. So now we're seeing that successful DNS redirect here. Okay, now let's take a look at application control. So with application control, we have, there's various applications that are categorized under, the following categories that we have here. And we can take action based off of a whole category, which encompasses many different applications. Or we can override and say, okay, I want to have a specific action for a specific application. So for example, let's look at BitTorrent. So if I were to add this application here, so right now BitTorrent, if we look at the description here, BitTorrent is a peer-to-peer technology, and it's under the category of P2P, which we do see, where is it? Right here. So right here on the far right, we see P2P. So in this particular case, when when a user is using BitTorrent, first the FortiGate, when it's identifying this traffic, first the FortiGate is going to be looking at this section, which is application and filter overrides. So in this particular case, if I were to click OK, we are going to see that BitTorrent would be blocked, even though the category is indicating that P2P is configured for monitor. Okay, so let's test here with TorGuard then. So we'll create a new signature or reference a signature. Okay, and just a brief update about what TorGuard is. It's a VPN application that can be used to pretty much change your public IP by using VPN as the technology, or it can be used to not have visibility from something like a firewall. In this case, the FortiGate will be able to, fortunately, have visibility to this application. Okay, so now let's try to use TorGuard. So, let's just use a fake account. Testing123@testing.com. Yeah, so we can see here that we can't even log in. So, usually I'd expect a little more from the application, but it kind of makes sense in this case is that the application is obviously expecting that there's nothing in the way here. So, it seems like if the application cannot reach out to the internet or reach out to whatever resource it needs to reach out to, it's just gonna, it's gonna get stuck there, right? So we don't have control over the specific application, but we do have control over what the application can communicate to. And in this case, it seems like the FortiGate effectively is blocking access to TorGuard servers. Let's take a look there. Okay. It seemed like the application did proceed and almost seemed to look like it was working, but it still is not working, right? Because these are fake credentials anyway. So let's take a look at our application control section under the login report area here. And yeah, we can see that when there's reach outs to TorGuard, they're all being blocked. Okay, and another item that we have here is IPS as well. So by default, obviously there's thousands and thousands of IPS signatures that the FortiGate is going to be able to block. But by default, how it works is that there's a medium, high, and critical filter section. So we have our medium, high, critical, and then based on that severity, based on any of these three severities, the FortiGate is going to take the default action based off of thousands of different signatures to protect the network. So you can modify these as you choose, maybe change the filter options, which are they're very broad, or you could actually configure specific signatures if you choose to as well. But yeah, the default would be medium, high, and critical. The default action will be taken there. One thing that is kind of cool too is that you can also enable packet logging. So if you enable packet logging here, then if an IPS signature is to be tripped and the FortiGate sees that, it will also save a copy of the packet capture so that you might be able to, for example, if you are seeing a false positive, or if you're even seeing a legitimate attack, you can verify that with the actual packet capture contents. I guess, yeah, and a few other security profiles or security configurations that are very worth mentioning, but maybe a little bit outside of this basic configuration video, would be, for example, file filter. It would be SSL inspection here. This being a very, very good topic if we're talking about having more visibility into our encrypted communication. The default is certificate inspection, but we can open up a lot of doors into visibility with deep inspection. Now there's caveats with deep inspection that should be considered too. And additionally, there's DLP, or data loss prevention. And let's look at a few other that would be under our system and feature visibility section. So email filter, so there is some basic anti-spam detection abilities on the FortiGate. Video filter as well, so that, for example, If you want to have YouTube videos that are categorized and action is taken based off of the category of the video, that can be done. Just to note is that requires deep inspection, which involves that SSL inspection category that we were looking at a moment ago. There's also some basic web application firewall functionality. Fortinet's product, the FortiWeb, has web application firewall integrated and a lot more functionality with regards to protecting web servers, but there is that basic functionality on the FortiGate as well. Let's see if there's any other here. There's also the DOS policy. So if you enable the DOS policy, it won't be under the firewall policy section, but it would be under policy and objects. I'll enable it in a second here and be able to show you. As well, there's VoIP. So, for ALG, SIP manipulation, VoIP is also another profile that can be enabled. So let's just apply a few of these just to give you kind of an idea as to where you would go to configure them. Okay, so after enabling that, let's look, for example, our IPv4 DOS policy here. So we can create specifics for DOS policies, specific thresholds, whether we're blocking or monitoring. So I'll let you take a look at that if that's something you're interested in. And then going back to our firewall policy section, we'll see that we've added a couple more items below here. File filter was already there, but email filter and VoIP has been added. We can also change the global inspection mode from flow to proxy based, and you'll notice that another security profile will be added, which is web application firewall. So the inspection mode must be proxy for web application firewall to be a feature that's enabled. Again, some of this stuff is a little bit outside of the scope of what we're doing right now, but it's something to consider, is that you need proxy-based inspection to be enabled for the web application firewall security profile to show up. And so let's dive into logging and alerts now. Okay, so if we go to login report and log settings, we can see that there's various different destinations that the FortiGate can log traffic logs and security logs too, right? So one could be the disk. And not every single FortiGate is going to have a disk, but that is an option. There's also memory, so logging to RAM. Now in that case, it is volatile. So if you reboot the unit, all logs will be lost. So it might be just for specific troubleshooting use cases. And then there's also sending logs to a FortiAnalyzer. It's another Fortinet product. It's really good for aggregating reports, for being able to identify logs from multiple different firewalls. There's also just sending logs to just a regular syslog server. And another option too is using FortiGate Cloud. So if we enable this cloud logging setting, we can also connect up to FortiGate Cloud, which there is a paid for version and a free version. In this case, let's just start by activating our account. So we use the same credentials that we would use when we access support.fortinet.com. So let's activate that account and then see when it's connected. Okay, and once we've activated FortiGate Cloud, we can go back to the dashboard and status section, and then we should see that this FortiGate Cloud widget shows as activated. And at this point, we can take a look at, say, our forward traffic logs. If we look in the top right corner here, we can see that the log destination, so all these logs that we're seeing here, they're stored on the physical disk that's installed in this FortiGate. But we can also see another log location, and now we can see that there are pretty much almost the exact same logs here that we're seeing when we're flipping between these two pages. We can see the logs from the destination as the FortiGate Cloud, and now all of our logs will be starting to populate now under these other sections. So now let's go over how we actually, how do we get these logs in this view that we're seeing here? How do we configure the firewall policy to log all this information, right? Well, it's all controlled based on our firewall policy. So, based on what we're seeing here, we have a couple logging options to determine what shows up under that login report page, right? So if we just have security events enabled, then only security events that are defined by these security profiles are going to show up in the forward traffic logs and various other logs, right? But let's say, for example, if we're just logging allowed traffic as security events, if we go on our device and we maybe we do a ping, for example, that traffic is not going to show up because it hasn't been triggered by any of these security profiles. Now let's just quickly test this by changing it to all sessions, and we'll save the policy. And then now every single session that gets established with the FortiGate on this firewall policy, that traffic is going to be visible to the FortiGate, and it's going to be logged. So let's just do a quick ping test here. And then now let's take a look and see if that log was created. Okay, so I just waited for just a couple minutes here, and then we could actually see that ping showing up, right? And the reason why we might have to wait a minute or two is because, like I was mentioning before, is that the log is being aggregated by the FortiGate, and then it gets sent off to FortiGate Cloud, and then needs to be read back to the FortiGate itself, right? But the idea is that we do have that visibility, and that's due to us making that configuration change on the firewall policy to enable logging all sessions. All right, so now let's quickly go over how we could create an email alert. So if we go to Security Fabric and Automation, and we create a new automation stitch, what we can do here is we can take a trigger. So this is pretty much going to be our triggering event, which maybe we'll just make it simple, and let's go over an event log entry. Let's say login. Okay, let's say we have an administrator login to the FortiGate itself that's failed. So we can take that and apply that as a trigger, and then we can add an action to say, okay, let's from the FortiGate, let's send out an email. And the email could be, really, whatever we type in here. Something along those lines, right? But that's the idea, how we can be alerted when something's happening based off of any type of custom trigger that we create here. Okay, so let's go over monitoring quickly and a little bit of troubleshooting. Right, so starting with monitoring, all of our monitoring dashboards are going to be available on the dashboard section, right? So if we start with the status section here, we can see that we have a bit of information about our CPU, about our sessions open on the firewall. We can also add, some information about, maybe we want to see some of the memory usage on the firewall. Maybe we also want to see some detail about certain, the bandwidth utilization on certain interfaces, right? So let's look at our WAN link. Let's see if there's anything else that maybe we'd want to see as well. Some detail about our DHCP clients that the FortiGate would be leasing out. Maybe some information about DNS as well. But you get the idea, is that there's a lot of different widget options that we have here to gain that monitoring visibility and fairly quickly, right? So here's an idea of how how the FortiGate, how quickly it's able to reach the DNS servers. Some information about the DHCP clients connected to the FortiGate. And we have bandwidth statistics, just in case there's bandwidth spikes, or users are noticing any type of latency or performance issues. Another thing we can do too is take a look at other dashboard options, which is network here. As we can see, it's using that DHCP widget that we added to the status dashboard there. But then, we also have our routes, which we covered before too. Get a quick view of the routing table without having to go in the CLI. As well, if we had IPsec or SSL VPN tunnels that are connecting or terminating to this firewall, we have that visibility here as well. And some of the things that we can also use for troubleshooting purposes would be to check our forward traffic log. I know we've been here a couple times already, but maybe based off of a timestamp from particular user, if they told you, okay, I was having an issue at this time, well, we can, look back in time and try and find out how the firewall was handling those sessions, maybe if it intentionally were blocking it, or even just what policy would that traffic have been hitting. We can also see, sort of our antivirus, web filter, application control, IPS logs here. We can also see event logs, so we have system event logs, maybe HA events if we have a high availability configuration here, some router events, VPN events. So a lot of resources under the log and report section. And then maybe we also want to do a couple basic packet sniffer diagnostics, whether it be on the GUI or on the command line, right? So if anybody is familiar with Linux and maybe TCP dump, then this comes very easy. Where really what we're doing is we're using diagnose or diag sniffer packet, and then in this any section here, this is pretty much saying I just want to sniff for packets regardless of which interface it arrives at and which interface packets are sent out on. You alternatively, if you just want to focus on a specific interface, you could pick, for example, WAN 1, and we would only be seeing packets that are specific to this interface. But in this case, just for example sake, let's just use any, and then we'll look for any traffic that's going to this host, which is 4.2.2.2. So let's just run a quick ping here, and then we'll just run one. There we go. Okay, so what's great here is we had some really good visibility as to the traffic flow here. So we can see that the echo request came into the firewall. The firewall successfully forwarded the packet to the WAN or to the ISP. And then we see that our destination 4.2.2.2 responded back, and our WAN 1 interface received that traffic. And then here's the egress packet coming back, the echo reply, going back to the client that actually initiated the ping. So it's a really good start to finish view of the firewalls receiving, I guess, ingress and egress on that packet capture there. And really, all you have to do is, once you get comfortable with just these, the diag sniffer packet any, and then, this is a 4.0, and then L is in Lima. We won't get into the specifics of what those mean, but we can in another video. And then, what's important is what we have in the brackets here, which is our filter. So you can change that to be a host or port range, but this is just a quick basic test here. Alternatively, another option, if CLI is not what we're looking for, or maybe we also want to have a little bit more of a, sort of like a Wireshark view of that packet instead, well, then we can go to the network and packet capture section, and, let's use, we do have to identify an interface here, and then using that same example though, let's look for traffic going to this same IP. Okay, so we've just created that packet capture. We start it. So now the firewall is listening for any traffic that would be going to that IP 4.2.2.2. So let's just do the exact same ping again. Okay, there we go. We immediately see that the sniffer picked up on that traffic, and now let's download that output. And just like that, we can see the traffic in Wireshark. So this might be really useful in a case where, maybe we need to confirm to the ISP that yes, the firewall is, say, receiving traffic, or yes, that, ultimately it's receiving traffic and it's egressing that traffic over to the ISP, and we can actually confirm, we can confirm the destination MAC address, which would typically be the ISP's MAC. Okay, so hopefully this was a valuable use of your time. I know this video was a little bit longer than maybe the average video out there, but the idea here is that I was hoping to make sure that we can save as much time for you in the long run. So yeah, with that, I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.